We greet you in the frameworks of the project City as a Classroom. Thank you for being with us today here.
Thank you for having me.
Since you are currently a Vice President of Smart Cities at Ookla, would you mind speaking a little bit about philosophy or the main goals of Smart Cities, what that structure was built for?
Well, smart cities means different things to different people. Each city has its own priorities and things they'd like to take action on. From our standpoint, our mission is really, a better internet for everyone. And connectivity has become so important to all of us as individuals, but it's also become more and more important to cities and enterprises as well, as we're seeing a lot of these new technologies come forward, such as smart lighting, things of that sort, that have been the basis of a lot of the discussions around smart cities. Ultimately, the connectivity has to be there in order for these devices to be able to reach back to a command center and to the servers that are monitoring them. So, from our standpoint, we want to, make sure that people understand that recognize that understanding how the network performs and the availability of the network within a given area is extremely important to all of these things working.
So you have been engaged in this area of wireless industry and network, all this digital things in about 1980s, right?
It's been a long time. I've been in the wireless industry since 1988. 85 was when I first got into it, but I started a company in 1988. So right at 35 years that I've been involved in the wireless industry.
Could we go a little bit back into history? Could you please speak of how do you think cities were transformed because of the emergence of all these new things that we have today? Because from one side, certainly all this technology makes our lives just much more better, more comfortable. But from the other side, there are certainly some disadvantages, some things that make things harder or even less secure.
Yeah, cities have changed quite a bit. Services within the cities, even things that you see on the street corner have changed. How many payphones do you see today? Not very many. Okay. But it used to be there was a street corner, every couple of blocks. And there was a payphone on every other street corner. And that's, that's just one of the differences. If people needed to let an appointment know if they were trying to get from one point in the city to another, traffic was bad, they didn't have a way to do that unless they would stop and find a payphone and call ahead. Now you can call from your car. It's made things very, much more efficient in many ways. The communications that cities have with their workers in the field has become so much more efficient. You still have private land mobile radio systems that are being used, but you can now reach, each and every one of those individual employees as opposed to just, someone who might be, supervising a crew. Citizens can report things to the city. When cellular began, you couldn't take photos with your phone. That really came along about 15 or so years ago, and started becoming really popular when the iPhone was introduced back in 2007. But it was around a little bit before then. But now people can take a picture of a pothole and communicate that to us, to the city Public Works Department. And so there's, a lot of things, a lot of new ways for citizens to engage and communicate that information, with the leaders of a municipality to let them know, what might need to be done.
My next question would relate to Speedtest, which was developed by Ookla. So during our last talk, you have mentioned that during coronavirus pandemic, the number of users of Speedtest have risen up to 20 million a day.
The average number of tests that we saw prior to the pandemic was roughly 10 million tests per day globally. And it did peak back in May. But on certain days, yes, we did see numbers like that. We saw numbers, 15, 18, 20 million tests some days as people were trying to figure out what connection problems they were trying to have as they were getting on these video calls like you and I are on right now. In addition to the fact that children had to go home to learn, college students had to go home to take classes remotely. And as everyone was now trying to get online at home, and someone is in the house is probably still trying to watch Netflix, okay? Putting all of that strain on the network, Speedtest is a really quick, easy way for people to help diagnose whether the problem is on their end or perhaps somewhere else.
Would you mind please sharing a little bit more about Speedtest? I mean, why did Ookla develop such a useful tool, which is basically free to use, as I know?
Well, Speedtest was originally developed to solve a problem by an ISP, and it spun out as a separate company. But the ISP wanted to be able to understand how their specific network was performing, because a network provider can only control what they actually own and operate. And of course, the internet is a large number of interconnected networks, right? It is a network of networks, if you want to think of it that way. But each company that builds and operates a portion of that can only control the portion that they own and operate. And so Speedtest is, and one of the most important things about Speedtest is the number of servers that we have and how they're distributed around the world. We have currently over 11,000 servers in over 190 countries, okay? And I mean, if you think about it, I mean, that's a pretty astonishing number. Here in the United States, we've got roughly 1,200, 1,300, I think. The number just keeps growing every month. We have servers in every state across the United States, in every province of Canada. And so you're always very close to one of these servers. I could provide you numbers on France, Germany, South Africa, Thailand, whatever. We've got just thousands of servers scattered around the globe. And because you're going to be close to one of those when you conduct a test, Speedtest actually looks at all of the servers that are very close to you and decides which ones are actually capable at a given moment of conducting a test. Servers get busy, right? Servers get, they get constrained as well. And so we run the test against the one that is, in your nearby area that's going to provide you with the best insights into what that local provider can actually give you as a customer. And we think that's an important distinction, because if you're testing a network, if you're testing against a server that's thousands of miles away from you, then you're going to hop through multiple segments of the internet to get there. And every time you change through a different network node, then that's going to impact your latency and it's going to impact your speed. And understanding how that local network is providing your service to you is extraordinarily important.
You manage a large number of people, and as an entrepreneur, what do you think are the factors in the city that are indispensable so that the company can run smoothly, especially when we speak about that type of area that you are dealing with? Because as far as I know, you do not work only in the state you are now, right? So you probably visit other cities as well.
Of course. A lot of our concentration is on infrastructure, not too surprisingly. But infrastructure, there's a lot of different things that fall into the infrastructure category, right? The basic things that cities have to provide. If you think about, one of the great civilizations that existed years ago, why did the Romans do so well? They built roads, right? They built ways to deliver clean water to their citizens. They built ways to pipe the dirty water away. And it's those types of things that to me are first and foremost the most critical. That is a city, ultimately, is where you got a lot of that infrastructure, roads, water, sewage, and then of course now power, which the Romans didn't have in terms of electrical power. They certainly had a lot of political power. But uh, then, on top of that, this internet connectivity is just another form of infrastructure. And cities managing this infrastructure is what allows their cities to move and go, and people get from one place to another, and maintaining public health. These are the most critical things. Now, there are lots of other services that governments have gotten into over the years, but I see that personally, at least, as the basic underlying premise of how a city begins, and table stakes, if you will, as far as how it can continue to grow. That infrastructure has to get built out as the city grows.
Another question is quite relative to the previous one, is about something related to culture and mentality. So even in the United States, even if it's one country, I mean, we all know that all states are a little bit different from each other. And so, for instance, if you would be in another state and you had to hire, let's say, new employees, I mean, would you pay attention to the mentality of the state? And if yes, in what ways? Because many people, they just forget that factor. I mean, they act the way they used to act in their own area. So they never take into consideration the background and culture of people.
It is important, and Ookla tries very hard, and I think we've done quite well in providing a comfortable environment for a diverse workforce. We have employees scattered across the globe. Our headquarters are in Seattle, and in Memphis we have an office, and in Dublin we have an office. But we also have some employees working from their homes on every continent except Antarctica. So it is important that we understand and recognize those cultural differences. Sure, here just in the United States, it's different. The culture in Seattle is different from Memphis. Memphis is different from New York City. South Florida is different from all of those. But it's, when you start looking at different countries, different languages, and what the history, what the religious beliefs may be within those areas, and different religions don't even take off the same, you don't even recognize the same days as weekends, right? And you have to recognize that some people take off Friday, some Saturday, some Sunday in order to worship. There are, if you're in France, you can buy a glass of wine at McDonald's. You cannot buy a glass of wine at McDonald's anywhere in the United States that I'm aware of. So companies do alter their behavior to fit better into the culture within which they want to exist and do business.
So, Bryan, now, if, like, hypothetically, if you imagine that the city you're living now, and you have been living for a while, if this was your classroom, a higher education of life, how would you describe the way it shapes you as an entrepreneur, as a person who manages people in different stages of life? Certainly 10 years ago, you were a different person. Now you're different.
Certainly. My children at this point are grown, our views, my wife and I, in terms of our views of what our daily lives are like, and how we're dealing with our kids that are now older, can drive themselves places, have jobs, is very, very different. And everyone goes through those different stages of life, whether they have kids or not. And sometimes people do find that they want something different. Maybe they want to live in a different place. But you do have, I think, regardless of where you live, you do have a lot of cultural differences that can exist in any city, but cities themselves do impact how people see the world. And I think density has a great deal to do with that. When you're living in a very large city like a Paris or a London or a Moscow or a New York, okay, that can be that density creates different requirements that the city has to provide, different ways to move around. You have mass transit in the form of subways across very few cities in the United States. There's very few that have any significant number of a significant number of miles of light rail. Okay, um, and but across Europe, you'll see more cities, still larger cities, but more cities typically that will have that type of a transportation system, which is part of the infrastructure as well, right? How do you get people from place to place? That allows so much more freedom of movement, and that can impact the city. If you're trying to get across now, right now during this pandemic, things are very different in New York. But if you're trying to drive through Midtown Manhattan, typically it took a long time. Traffic's very slow. There's a lot of cars trying to pack very small places, and and so people are forced into mass transit, taking buses, taking subways. Um, Talking about swinging back to one of your other questions that I think ties into this well. Think about what 4G did as that rolled out. Okay, that 4G level of connectivity allowed us to completely change how we navigate the world, how we find our way from one point to another, whether it be within a city or between cities through the rural areas. Um, it allowed you to look at an application on your phone, call a car through Uber, Lyft, or one of the other taxi type services, and that car you'd see it coming to you right there on your handset, and you'd know that it was about to come right around the corner to pick you up and take you where you needed to be. That's a pretty astonishing change. And the taxi companies have had to shift how they operate and what kind of services they offer. And some of them haven't done well and have not survived as Uber and Lyft has displaced them. But that technology is progress ultimately, and it is so much more convenient than trying to chase down a car in the middle of traffic when it's raining, you know, just in a hard downpour. It makes a big difference in the quality of our lives.
Thank you, Bryan. Would you like to add something that would relate to City as a Classroom?
Right now, we're not allowed to travel very much, but I think travel is extremely important. I think people that have the opportunity need to get out, visit these different cultures, understand how these different cities were built based upon their age, based upon the culture that they were built within. Um, because that does impact how people live within these cities and work within these cities, where you have hubs where almost all the activity is in one location, as opposed to a city like a Paris, where you have storefronts everywhere. That you have storefronts built in the bottom of all of these apartment buildings, right? And you don't see that across cities that are newer as much. I think a lot of people are trying to get back to that. There's a high level of attractiveness to, if you live in a high rise, to be able to walk down and find whatever you want within a few blocks walk. And that's not something we experience here in Memphis. We're a mid-sized city in the United States. We do have a nice downtown that had gone through like most cities in the United States, had gone through a very difficult time for several decades and is now coming back. And they're trying to add, retail storefronts, in new buildings that are being built to make sure that they're not just single purpose. But living here is very different, but we don't have the traffic, that a San Francisco does. We don't have a traffic that, that you would find in Berlin or in Rome. And so there's an attractiveness to that as well. But we also we only have one professional sports team. You know, we have one, we have we have one truly large professional theater downtown where you can go see a play. So our options in that respect are limited. We've got a lot of good food here, but we don't have nearly the number of restaurants that you're going to find in a Chicago or a Barcelona or a Rio, right? And so these are important differences, and these are the kinds of choices that people need to make ultimately. And where would I like to live, and what kind of amenities would I like to have? And these bigger cities are just going to have more to offer, but you're also then dealing with, more crowding, more traffic, et cetera. Cities are a classroom in so many different ways. There's so much you can learn by just visiting different locations, even in your own city. A lot of people don't get out and about very much. There's so many cultural opportunities when you bring that many people together, and whether it be museums, whether it be parks, whether it just be the food scene that's available. This is all an important part of learning and growing as a person, and starting to understand other cultures, because there are regardless of where you live, there are other cultures right there in your city, if the city's any decent size at all. Getting out and understanding, the history of your city, paying attention to the architecture within that city. How is your city built? Just over the last 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, you look across a country that's as young as the United States, and many of our cities didn't even exist 200 years ago. When you look at cities across Europe, and what is a big city now versus what it was 500 years ago is very different if you look back into history. But a lot of these larger cities have been there for a very long time, and they've built in layers. I was in Paris a few years ago, and went into the Paris Underground to see where they had to move all the bones of the bodies that had been buried on the particularly on the central aisle where Notre Dame is located. And it's really fascinating to understand how those cities were built, how they came to be, and understand a little bit about the folks that originated them. Why did they settle there? What made it a good location? Is very often that it's on a river. You've got to have a decent water source. You need a good supply of food nearby. Can you grow crops? Can you fish? This is a lot of what these, why these cities ended up being built where they did. And then over time, how they have stretched the resources in their area has been an interesting story as well. Take a look at Los Angeles, that has millions of people, yet only about the water supply necessary to support only about 250,000 people. And they've had to bring that water in from hundreds of miles away in order to be able to sustain the growth of the city. So those environments can sometimes be restrictive and can keep a city from growing, but you can also see how cities get around these problems and how they solve for these problems so that they can continue to grow. We talked a little bit earlier about infrastructure. We measure broadband network availability. Now, through 4G communications and soon to be 5G communications, which is going to provide significant increases in speed, what you're going to be able to do and learn within the city is going to continue to change and improve. Look at what 4G did for our navigation. 5G is going to do even more. There are devices coming to market that are going to allow you to experience not just virtual reality, which a lot of people hear about and is big in the gaming world, but augmented reality. You'll be able to walk down the street and it'll actually guide you with images in front of your face as to you're going to be turning at the next level. You won't even really have to look at your phone ultimately in order to be able to see, in order to be able to guide it, in order for the network and that connectivity in conjunction with the device that you are wearing or holding in your back pocket provides you navigation to wherever it is that you want to go. But you'll also be able to learn about history in the buildings. As new apps are built, you'll actually be able to look at a building and call up information on it and be able to see, what businesses are there, perhaps when the building was built. There's all kinds of treasure troves of information that municipalities have. And through these various open data sources that they're opening up, people are going to be able to build applications to guide you through a city. And you're going to be able to share that information with others. So think about someone who isn't physically able to travel, perhaps due to their age, perhaps due to a disability. And their ability to actually learn and experience a city that they can't even be in could be shared with them by a relative or by a touring company. So there's going to be all sorts of new ways to learn about cultures in other cities, whether or not you're even able to travel there, as these new networks and higher levels of connectivity come online.
Well, Bryan, thank you very much for the interview. It was a pleasure.
It's a pleasure here as well. Thank you for having me.